Hello, welcome to the second of our urban agriculture webinar series. Our first was talking about backyard conservation, and today we will be talking about creating community gardens. Our audience is a little different than it was for the last one in that we sort of tried to reach out to more community leaders, but that said, what we really wanted was to make sure that everybody had a chance to sit in and learn more about how to form and start a community garden in your city or town. A couple of things, some sort of housekeeping things. Everybody will be muted for most of the webinar. However, we are going to be having question and answer sessions scattered during the webinar. So when it gets to that point, we are going to look for the menu and you'll be able to raise your hand, so to speak, and we will unmute you to ask questions. Also, we do have a questions pane, so if you ever need to, as you're thinking about it, if you want to type in a question, that's fine, and we will try to answer those questions as we go along as well. We have our two presenters are back. Curtis Swantak, I never am sure if I'm saying that right. And Robert Sabo? Sabo, and yep. we just know him as Bob here at the office, so you're going to be hearing us call him Bob. And we have a couple of people trickling in, and I know people try to be on time, but sometimes with the internet, things have gotten pretty slow. So I think with that I think it's okay to get going. So our first presenter, Curtis, is going to get us started. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera and my mic, and I will hand it over to Curtis.
Thank you. And take a point out, I did see that Kay Snyder is in the webinar today. Kay is one of the main organizers at the Indiana Community Garden. So she definitely will be a wealth of information and for part of when we get to the questions and then answer period. But in general, I want to start out with who benefits from the community garden, and there's some real easy ones to hit off that you can say people that don't have actual space to do a garden, whether it's because they don't have a yard or live very close in a very close situated community. One of the major things that I like about a community garden, it gives access to people with disabilities or limited mobility. People that normally can't get down on the ground, especially by themselves. People that need just that extra hand. It can be the elderly because they have mobility that, they might have gardened their whole lives, but they just can't get the completeness of it anymore due to age. The people that also benefit is the broader community. Obviously you get a green space. This will be the one of many times I refer to the Indiana's garden. But it's nice when you go down Carter or 6th Street and there's this nice beautiful green space of growing and producing food in the middle of town. There's also individuals and groups that benefit from the food production in that garden. Sometimes the food can be grown together as a group and then it's given to soup kitchens and food banks. Sometimes they do like door to door with the elderly. It also helps the people that are underserved in the sense of underserved in resources. Like they might not be able to get a garden going by themselves, but with a little bit of help, they can do that and then provide food for their family. So that brings us to, with any group, you need an organization. There's many ways to structure the organization and the physical garden itself. Two key points I wanted to get out there was to set clear roles and responsibility for your volunteer leaders and develop a clear and simple rule sheet for participants to follow. There's a lot of different roads and different paths you can choose for how you want the garden to physically be, how you want your organization to be. Those things can grow organically within time that you grows the organization and see what fits best for where you're at. There's no copy and paste easy sheet to do with making any group of volunteers work well and provide for the whole. I also want to remind to work with local authorities or landowners to have clear use agreements and proper access and parking to garden areas. You don't want to pick somewhere. If you pick public ground, something that's owned by a township or a town or borough, do you want a clear expectation on that ground? Lots of people are going to have, people say, well, what about the insurance, or what about this? You want to get those questions out of the way before any sort of investments put into effect, especially soil amendments, which is something we'll get to later, being one of your more expensive items. At this point, I did want to take a point to address, see if there was any questions of Timothy, if you could double check to see if anybody wants to say something at this point. Okay, not hearing anything from Timothy. I will move on. So here is an easy example. Like, this is an example of how many different ways a community garden can look like, in size and scope and layout. There's a ton of options that anybody can do when starting a garden, from raised beds to just flagged out areas in an open field. Things to consider, like how, the access, like we said earlier about access. Do you want more flat grounds to give access to those underserved people that we talked about? Do you want, is there enough parking so that not everybody's parked on a road? Is it a place that has public access to more than just the people that are going to be in the garden, such as within a county park or something? Those are all things you want to consider when laying out your garden. And then naturally, there also is the agronomic things to take into consideration when laying out your garden. You don't want certain plants near each other. Certain plants need to pollinate and need to be separated. Those type of things also come into question with that. One of the biggest points within that I want to get to is the balance between ease and expense. And that really comes down to the raised beds cost more money to get started, but provide cleaner arrangements and better access to people with mobility issues. One of the biggest things I see is like someone in a wheelchair, or someone that can't stand and needs to have one of the chairs that you carry along with you. Raised bed really works and helps with them. And a lot of times those people don't have the ability to build their own raised beds at home. That's where this fills a key role for people in the community, is the access for those types of people. Another thing is, if you do, whether you do foot or raised beds or flagged out area, foot traffic around plots will cause bare ground. So items like you can either mulch or gravel or put ample space between beds to avoid that problem, so there's not a concentration of traffic. And then the balance of it, flagged off plots don't require any startup costs, but can be messy, quote unquote, when you're trying to organize and differentiate whose plots and what belongs to the garden, what belongs to individuals. Moving on. So here's just another example of a flagged out plot, and a picture that will tie to the next slide of if you didn't plan it, do not pick it. Or actually, I'll apply a couple slides from now. At this point, this is where we're going to switch to the group versus individual. This is also building on that organizational level of your planning. Will the garden be made up of plots for just individuals, or those that everyone works on? Are you going to have what would be called the community plots, or plots that people pay for to have their own? What chores within the whole garden will be group activities, and what will be for the individual? Will there be community tools? Is there local storage space for the community tools? Those are all things that come into question when you're trying to organize this. And obviously a lot of it can be done as time goes on and as you get into it, but there are definitely things you can start planning for and think about when you're doing that. Still on the group versus individual, some tasks should be done as a group and slash by the organization. Things that come to my mind are that the key points is things that maintain soil quality and things that are too small or too large for an individual. So things such as cover cropping, mulching, composting, those things should always, I feel, should be done by the group. That way that no individual plot of ground is losing out because an individual can't or is unwilling to do things such as the good soil help, as cover cropping and mulching. And then those are also big items to do. It's hard just to compost by yourself. It's easier to compost as a group. I'll say we'll open up for another point of questions before moving on. Let anybody tag in where they want to have a question or comment. I don't see anybody yet. So moving on. So here's moving on to what everybody likes is what you're going to eat.
Curtis,
yeah.
Curtis, we do have a question. Kay Snyder is asking, any comments on getting soil tests before starting? Was that something we're going to talk about later?
It might be mentioned later, but if I can hit it now before we start actually talking about crops, that's definitely something you want to do as it's very early on, because that can give you insight on to what you want to do then. If your soil is very poor in the general area where you want to do the garden, then that makes raised beds seem a little bit more attractive, because then you can import soil and aggregate soil and topsoil to jumpstart the biological activity. It will be easier to start to get the garden started and people have more production doing a raised bed of imported soil over top of poor soil. On the flip side of that, if you have really good soil, then it might make you want to say, no, we don't want to do raised beds. This soil is really good. Or it just gives you the ability to, based on the preferences of the people involved, whether you want to use chemical fertilizers, do you want to do a year of prep that is mulching and compost layers with some cover cropping to build organic matter, and then in the following year do open it up to vegetable growing? Those are all things that can be considered and are definitely things that need the soil test to give you the best idea to do. Hopefully that answered Kay's question. So moving on to crops. These are crops that I believe would work best grown communally. There's things that people only use a little bit of, and it's difficult to grow, or it's something that you plant one plant and have a whole bunch from it, multiple harvests, things such as, or things that are not during the normal gardening year, such as like garlic's a winter crop. Asparagus is a multi-year crop, so things that you don't want to take up space in individual plots. Potatoes, because they take the whole year and take up a lot of space and need a little bit extra care compared to other row vegetable crops. Like I said, the crops with multiple harvests. I know Kay at the community garden, they do the lettuce and the garlic as a group, and it's worked out well. And then also things that are grown as a group give you the ability, then you can share that with the group, and any excess goes straight to any group of people you want to help outside of the garden. I think this is the point we'll switch over to Bob. So I'm gonna mute my camera.
Okay. So just
let me know when you want me to move.
Okay, I will. So just sort of picking up where Curtis left off there. Some thoughts for some easy crops if you're a beginner in gardening, and specifically in the community gardens. Just things that are real easy to grow and really don't need a whole lot of maintenance on your end. Herbs are really good, such as parsley and basil, any sort of leafy greens, as Curtis had mentioned, lettuce or kale or any other number of the leafy greens, and also cherry tomatoes, as opposed to large regular sized tomatoes. They just sort of keep growing on their own and keep ripening, and are really just a lot easier to maintain. You can go ahead to the next slide then, Curtis. Another thing, and this really ties in to our project that we did over at Mac Park with the Indiana Community Garden, is planting flowers near your garden. They'll attract pollinators to the area, bees and butterflies and other insects, which will ultimately increase your yields. And over at Mac Park, we planted a pretty sizable pollinator meadow, a lot of native flowering plants to attract the native pollinators in our area. And I think that's coming along really well. And that's just something you want to think about. It's not just about the vegetable plants that you're planting. Those plants all need to be pollinated, and attractive native, specifically flowers to attract the pollinators will really help in that regard. Go ahead, Curtis. And then to sort of pick up on, Curtis had that interesting picture a few slides back about harvest theft or whatever. It's something that you will need to think about ahead of time. Is what you're growing, is that meant just for those members of your organization? And if not, one thing to think about is that the large, colorful, and very eye-catching fruits and vegetables, specifically that can be seen from the roadways, going to attract attention from the rest of the community. And you can have people going in and just picking things for themselves, saving a trip to the grocery store. And maybe in some ways, that's okay with your organization. Maybe that's part of the goal is to provide this stuff for the community at large. But a lot of times, if people put a lot of work into growing these plants, and their prized tomato that they were going to take to the county fair gets picked and eaten, then that could be a problem. So it's just something to think about. And I guess here could be another moment we can take any questions that get popped up.
Yeah, we're up to the question slide, but I do want to, if Kay would like to say a few words, being our resident community garden guru, if you could unmute her, Timothy, give her a chance to bring in her wisdom.
Okay, Kay is unmuted.
All right. Yes, Kay Snyder here from the Indiana Community Garden. I know one of the concerns when we started our garden was the issue of vandalism, and there's another part of and I'm happy to report that it was not as problematic as we thought, although it does happen. But I do think it's really important to consider your site in terms of vandalism as well. Some sites that are very isolated and maybe nice in a lot of ways, but you have to realize that may be a site that's more prone to certain kinds of vandalism. In Mac Park, it actually has fence around it, and the gates are locked at night. So some kinds of vandalism are much, much less likely to happen. But I want to mention another kind of vandalism that can happen. And we're very lucky there that there are gates and there are hawks overhead. And that is really consider in terms of site whether there's the possibility of animals vandalizing. I have been involved with a community garden plot over at Chevy Chase, near Chevy Chase Community Center, and that they didn't have a fence around it, and we were bringing in some supplies to plant that day, and we realized because of the deer that roamed through there, that unless we got a fence around that space, it was really likely to be all munched up by the next morning. So again, I would really suggest, if somebody's going to be involved in a community garden and trying to pick a site, that you get multiple people to look, including a conservation district, for example, or an extension office, to assess the site for sun and water, and sometimes too much water, unless you're using raised beds, can be an issue, but also where are the paths that certain kinds of animals. Around here, deer are a real issue that you really need to be thinking about, and how you protect your plants from that. Not to say you can't protect from deer, but I've been in sessions where they said, if you have a garden and you don't have 2 7-foot-high fences around it, you can have an issue. We've benefited from hawks that fly overhead that get rabbits and so on, but raised beds are a little bit easier as well that way. So that's a comment on vandalism. One other comment I'd like to make is about who a community garden can help. And one of the things that's been clear to me is that when people are volunteers, and we've had volunteers as young as preschoolers and all the way to senior citizens, but those volunteers also, it can be not only helping, but what they can learn. A lot of people have learned about planting garlic and have been very excited to learn that, for example, but it's really possible to have volunteers who are learning things and then are able, when they are maybe they're young people, maybe they're going to be able to start a garden or to help in another community garden. So I think that's another benefit of all of this. So thanks for letting me say some things. And
if I can piggyback on that a little bit, Kay. One of the things, Karen is in the office, and she pointed out to me that one of the groups we overlooked that can be helped by community gardens is homeless shelters, that a lot of times they need food and kind of get overlooked as far as that service goes. So it's definitely one of the things you can look up if as one of your organizations, is find out who your local homeless shelters are and reach out to them and see what they need as far as food goes.
Right, a very good point. And one of the things that has changed over time for us, at first, we were not, when we very first started this garden 10 years ago, we were not originally getting food into a food bank, into a soup kitchen, and so on, and sharing it with volunteers. But we began to realize what a great need there was in the community. Things changed this year under COVID, and the needs even went higher. So we ramped up our production in our community beds because there was such a need. And one thing that we were able to do that is, I think, really exciting is we were able to harvest in the morning and get it over to a soup kitchen where they were using a window to get food as takeout out to people. And that was such fresh lettuce and greens, and they were not able to store a lot, but they were having very, very fresh lettuce, and it would have been cost prohibitive if it had not been donated.
Yeah, and building on that, Kay, I was like, it's not only helping the other people in your community. You're helping the people that are at the garden, that community. You're helping the larger community, but it's all based on using the fresh local foods. No matter what it is, I got to plug for fresh local foods. So that is 100% the best option.
Yeah, and we have one thing that's happened at the Indiana Community Garden, and I think it's true of other gardens. Not all gardens are like ours, where there's a combination of individual plots and then also community plots. But in cases where there are community plots, the benefit to the people who are helping with things like harvesting and realizing more about the need in the community for fresh and local food. Learning from those, we have many people who are from other countries who are growing things they could not even get in the grocery store, and it would be cost prohibitive to get the quantities that they would use in their local cuisine. But the inspiration for those who have come through there, and I remember one woman, she came with her children, and they decided if they could build them here, we can build a garden at our house. We can build a raised bed. And she later reported that her children, who before didn't like to eat vegetables, and I think this is something I've heard over and over again, that kids that don't like vegetables, it's a whole different deal. And for adults too, if you are picking it right and you grew it yourself, or you helped grow it, or you watered it, and then you're eating it totally fresh. That is a really different thing. And I really do believe if we can get kids hooked on fresh local vegetables, there's just nothing like it. And the chances of them getting hooked and thinking that's really a neat thing to eat. But anyway, she reported her children then loved vegetables because they could pick them right away and eat them right away.
Yeah, I know for me, here's just a little anecdote about the importance of local fresh stuff. Is I just made a dish the other night that I thought I had made before, but somehow was like, why is this so much blander than I remember it being? And I realized it was because the other times I had made it, it was cabbage and carrots that had come from the farmer's market. So it had come from someplace relatively close and probably harvested that morning or maybe the day before. Whereas what I had that I was cooking this with was carrots that had been sitting in my fridge for a couple of weeks now because I could only get the really big bag, and a cabbage that probably had come here from California. So it's just legitimately does not taste the same when it has to be carted across the continent and has been harvested differently. Oh, thanks. Like to set up meeting at greenhouse. Oh, so is there any way to set up a meeting at our greenhouse or set up
My greenhouse.
at your greenhouse?
Yeah.
Oh, Karen is here. Karen, how about you just talking to my mic laptop and ask your question?
I would like to set up a meeting with you guys to come out to the greenhouse and see the different raised beds material that we use. We use everything from rocks to telephone poles, just a number of various things, and how they're set up. I think it would be very, very useful, and how we do the plantings, it would be useful also from very early spring to actually going in past frost in the fall.
That's for anybody interested, Karen. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And if anybody is, we can get in touch with us at the district and we'll get you in touch with Karen.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Karen. Okay. Were there what other questions did people have that anybody needed to ask? I do remember one other thing I was thinking earlier was about volunteering and what the volunteers get out of it is that some people at the community garden is where they learn the skills in order to make a garden at home. So sometimes with a community garden, you're not just teaching people the importance of local food or creating the opportunity for more local and hopefully healthier food. You're also just giving them those skills so that so that it'll sort of get rid of that nervousness about, oh, how do I do this? And how difficult could this be? Because maybe they have a backyard and they've always wanted one, and now your community garden is a chance for them to volunteer to practice to see what this looks like so that they can start gardening at home as well. And also, Kay was talking about some of the other community groups. As some of you already know, I spent a few years out in Iowa, and the particular area where I was living in, we have a refugee population there. And as when in all of these cases, you know, when people come, they can't afford to buy a house. They're working very hard at the local factories, but they're living in apartment buildings, living in very limited options as far as doing their own gardening. But they came from places where they were growing their own food. And before war had come and completely disrupted their lives, they had been mostly self-reliant as far as buying their own food, sharing with their neighbors, that sort of thing. And a community garden was one of those things where they were able to build up that self-reliance, get all of the emotional and mental health healing that comes from gardening, and also able to, again, go back to growing the food that they were familiar with. And it was easier for them to cook the cuisines that they knew because they were able to grow the food that they knew. So I think different communities having different needs, that's one of the things you can think about is you may have a refugee or an immigrant community that just has these really simple needs that can be easily addressed and have just huge impact for how little cost goes into that. We do have another question from Kay. She's still unmuted, and even if people don't plant,
it's not a question. But first, another benefit is even if people don't plant a garden ever themselves, although many people are inspired to do that as they learn the skills, as Tema has said, I've been struck by just helping to plant, how much more appreciative people can be of what goes into gardening and farming. And I do think those are people who are going to be more supportive of local food, farmers markets, etc., which I think is really important. Another thing to mention along the lines that Timothy is mentioning about the cultural issue. In Indiana, we have many people from other countries who have had plots at the community garden. And many of us who have grown more have learned a lot from them about foods that we're not familiar with. They've shared something of their cuisine, and it's another kind of way to, I think, build community in spite of differences between people, which I think is really, really exciting. And to share that knowledge base with young children as well. So I think there's just the benefits just keep going on and on and on. There's really just so many benefits for the community of that kind of sharing and having a safe space where people of different backgrounds can come together and learn from each other.
There's a lot of rumbling outside the building. I don't know if it's being picked up on my mic or not.
Yeah, we're still good there. No worries. Yeah, so if nobody else has any questions or comments, anything, yeah, this is recorded / I'll bring up our contact page here. You know, any reach out, feel free. We're always available. We're always available to help at any point in a process, at any planning or building or otherwise. If you never did a soil test before, you can ask us so we can help with that. There's no wrong question. And if that's it, Timothy, if you want to do one last track.
The other thing I can think of is when you start, looking into and planning what you want your garden to look like, there are a lot of other examples out there that you can look at. So look at how a lot of community gardens have been done, because each one of them is going to be different, and each one has different needs that they're trying to meet. And also each one has different stories of like, well, this is what we learned and this is what we're doing differently now. and this is what we need to improve and what we're working on. And you can learn a lot just from that. So there are some really good things that are happening in Pittsburgh as far as urban community gardens are going. Some of the major cities are working on that, and it doesn't have to be just a big city thing. It can be, even if you're a town around rural areas, that doesn't mean we can assume that, oh, there's so many farms around, we don't need community gardens because everybody has a garden. It can be really easy to think that and to get that perception, but the reality is there may be a segment of your population that's being overlooked, that either they have to live in an apartment and can't afford the property or the land to have their own garden, or it's elderly who have had to scale down from the farm but really miss gardening, that sort of thing. So figure out what your community needs and see what other communities are similar to yours that are out there that are looking at the same needs and have their own community gardens. And I think that'll sort of shorten the learning curve and really help you decide going forward what you want to do.
Yeah, I would say a main takeaway would definitely be that there's always someone that needs access to food or the ability to be closer to food production.
And we do have a question from Shelby. She is asking, how do you find people who may be interested in a community garden? I've tried in the past and my area seems uninterested, which is a shame.
Yes. Sometimes I like to think of, sometimes it takes the champion, the one person to start, and then others will follow, the field of dreams scenario. And things is it does not have to be complicated or expansive. Yeah, you could start out with a lot that is, big enough for 20 people to have plots, but you can start out with just a couple plots. Start out with a couple plots, a sign, and some nice flowers, and hope for attention, work for attention, and slowly but surely someone could get into it. I think we hit a roadblock with a lot of things, not just in our community gardens or any community effort, but in agriculture and anything of, there's no one interested. And I think it's just a matter of reaching out, and you just got to have for that one person to hear what you have to say or see what you've done. Bob, anything?
I think you hit it right on the head there, Curtis. Sometimes it's just a matter of you starting it and people seeing the results, and it can really snowball.
Can I make
Sorry, Shelby, were you on? Who was talking? Was that you?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, one of my recommendations would be to see if there's any organizations in your community that might be a naturals to reach out to. And that would include whether it's an organization like an extension office, not necessarily that they would start this or be a longtime partner, but helping. I mean, it's key that it be a decent site that's going to have a chance of success, and you can really start out small. But and a conservation district, trying to see what organizations are there that might have certain expertise. To me, that's really important, that there's some partners potentially that could be helpful. I don't think it takes a lot of people, but sometimes having some organizations that could be supportive to think of what are the resources available in your community. So those are two, but I know in our case, if there's maybe student groups, whether it's at public schools, high school, or university, whether it's a Girl Scout troop or whatever, that doesn't mean that will last in the long run. But I think if you can find, if there's some organizations that might be helpful in starting and reaching out certainly to friends and all. Maybe there's a garden club. In our case, there were a couple of different garden clubs who in one case planted a bed, another case started a bed, and then later they could not maintain it as their members were getting older. But again, all of these were ways to get a certain thing done. Also, look for organizations that could be helpful as far as some support, whether it's financial or otherwise. But again, just really assess the resources in your community. And I mean, I agree with what Curtis and Bob are saying about it really doesn't take a lot of people, but it's helpful if you know some resources are there to help you make some wise decisions and to move forward with the idea. And then others, I think when that happens, can help along. But you really don't start too big. Don't start bigger than you can handle. There's plenty of ways you can expand, and as a matter of fact, Curtis came to us about this idea of a grant, which is what led to the pollinator meadow. So there can be things down the way, but you don't want to start with more than you're going to be able to handle. One bed is going to be great if it's attractive, and again, it can be combined, as we're doing now, as we're developing a food forest. It can be combined with trees. If part of it is even seeing if there's some available land. There's programs in many communities where, say, some land, there's some funding there to help get some land that might be not utilized in other ways. And maybe Curtis, Bob, you have some resources that you could send to Shelby related to that. I think it's Shelby's the one that asked the question.
And I was to say, building on what you said, that's a key point, is it doesn't have to always be a long-term partner. You could have a Boy Scout troop that they do, a couple Eagle Scouts build you a couple raised beds, and that's the limit of their interaction, but that's one more step, a helping hand, getting you to, better and bigger. And I was going to say organizations, so any fraternal organization or community organization like Rotary, Lions, even more on the municipal side of things, the volunteer fire department or police department, they also may have the ability to give you a little bit of support, volunteer or reach in the outreach, but they also might own a little piece of land that is also the ability to do that on. You can start a community garden at the local moose that owns a 3/4 of an acre next to their building, and then that can be the home of the community garden, and they can be one of the founding partners and want to have a bet in that and be a part of their community outreach and community betterment.
I was just thinking, when this question first came up, I also went straight to thinking about schools, and that's definitely becoming a more popular thing, is for a school to have a productive garden. And there are grants for that, for if you're going to be partnering with a school. The grants exist for putting in gardens, environmental sustainability programs, those sort of things. The other thing I was thinking is retirement homes, or retirement, sort of retirement communities, because they have tons of turf that needs to be turned into something that's not turf. So if there's any way you can get sort of get an inside connection with those retirement communities and be like, hey, I'll put this together so that your members can just can garden and do it, but I'll take care of it, and now it's that much less you have to mow, and sort of to do this like shared efforts and all around benefits that can happen with a partnership like that.
Timothy, this is Doug. I just also wanted to add, so I live in Johnstown. I don't live in Indiana, but I'm from Indiana. And in Johnstown, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, there was a pretty significant push to take blighted properties and turn them into community gardens. But one of the parts that they missed when they were doing this was involving the local residents around those community gardens in the process. So you had these groups that don't necessarily, of people that don't live in those communities, putting together a community garden and then stepping away and wondering, why isn't anybody, you know, taking ownership of this? Why doesn't anybody want to maintain this garden? And it's, a lot of it is, you know, before you start a project, making sure that you understand what the purpose and intent of that garden is. So if your goal is to have this be a community garden that serves that greater community where the garden is located, then in the initial steps, you need to involve the people in the planning, not just go in and build a garden and stick it there and hope that somebody's going to take it over. Now, if you're building the garden for your own purposes, for a smaller group or something like that, that's a different scenario. So it's important to keep that into perspective as you move forward.
Yes, I wanna second what Doug is saying there. And there's an example in Indiana County, as we were starting the community garden, and it involved a place where senior citizens were living, assisted living. And lots of resources went into this, but they really had not worked closely enough with the residents who were upset for some of the wildlife that was being that they were watching and so on. I mean, in other words, if you've got to either, there's got to be a buy-in from the various local groups, and otherwise it's not going to work long term. And to realize those involved can change, but if the people that it's supposed to be serving are not buying into it, it's not going to work super well. And if it's only outsiders who are coming in to build the beds, and it's fine, a Boy Scout troop, we had university students who were helping community people, that works great. But just realize, if it's only to build the beds and there's nobody that is interested in continuing or getting involved, that can be an issue. So again, I think planning ahead of time is super crucial, and the location is super crucial as well.
Yeah, I feel like that's I feel like that's maybe one of the things we didn't talk enough about is where it's located in the community can make a big difference as to who has access and who doesn't. And so if your community is way out on the edge of town, and a person without a car isn't able to reach it, then you might not be reaching the population that you want to reach. And so part of what your planning can also be is trying to do what you can as far as community outreach, as far as surveys. Find out where people are getting their food, find out what they're missing that they wish they had. Maybe there's some local stats that can, maybe there's some local organizations that are collecting that data already as far as food insecurity goes. And that can go a long way in addressing, and that can go away in addressing this too. But yeah, it hadn't occurred to me that you know, when we were talking about this, I think all the gardens that we had dealt with, there had always been this is the committee who oversees this and makes sure it happens and is doing all the planning, and that there was this continuation. It hadn't occurred to me that there were community gardens where they kind of built it and then they're like, okay, here you go, and sort of walked away from it, thinking that, you know, just the neighbors were going to like, oh, here's my plot, now I garden, and that there wasn't any sort of oversight after that. But I guess that's the thing I hadn't thought about before. But now that I think about it, it's like, oh, I guess I can totally see that happening.
Yes, community gardens don't always thrive in the long run. Many do, but there's, again, there's a number of things that can cause challenges. And one issue that hasn't really been mentioned much here, but I really feel like I need to say it, and that is in considering making sure that you're doing a soil test, I would also, it's really, really important that someone who knows what they're doing, make sure that you are testing if there's any possibility of contaminants on that property, that the soil tests involve things like testing for lead or whatever, you know, that somebody is looking at that property and thinking, are there any other things we need to test for in this particular location? And I don't know, anybody from the Conservation District, can you mention some things that would be important to consider? Because there are places, not just in cities, but where, and this is true of people putting in gardens in their own property as well, where they would really need to make sure there's no contaminants that, again, you can work around some of them. You can build raised beds with things underneath, but you need to know what you're dealing with and not just assume this property never was used for purposes that could be problematic.
Yeah, I would definitely say extension is a great source for resource for that, because they get in touch with the Penn State Soil Lab and the soil scientists in the State College. And then that also ties into what Doug said about involving the actual local people in that community. If you're not living in that area, local history can give you a big insight onto what you might need to expect to find under the soil when you start looking at it. You know, was this lot a business for, you know, brick business building for 50 years, or was it a slag dump?
Yeah, one of the things you'll have to think about sort of living in more of the Rust Belt is heavy metal contamination from things like coal burning and coal ash dumps and that sort of thing. If there's been any, if you're sort of in the, I don't know what the term is, like the rain shadow, but some of the smoke pollution from some of the particulate matter from some of the from pre-EPA industries when they had their tall smokestacks, you want to find out if you're sort of in the rain shadow of where that stuff fell out onto your, if you're in that property. That's a little bit more difficult to, but just look at the wind directions and look back at like 30 or 40 years and be like, what was being produced in Chicago or Pittsburgh or Columbus or that sort of thing. Most of the time it's not a problem, but sometimes if you're living really close, then you're sort of in that fallout of where that particulate matter was. So mercury, lead, those are things that can accumulate in the soil that you might want to look for and check for. If you do come up, there are ways to remediate soil that has that kind of industrial pollution. And this is something that's very common in some of the Rust Belt cities like Detroit, is before they can even think about planting a garden, they have to go through 2 or 3 years worth of remediation. And so there are special grasses that they grow in these areas that you give it 2 or 3 years of just growing this grass. You do a fall harvest of the grass. It's treated like a toxic waste because of how much of the pollutant it holds in its stem. But in the process of doing that, it sort of sponges out. It soaks up all of those pollutants, and then they're removed from the soil. And after that, you can go back to actually planting in the soil. So that's one of those things where you can decide, well, we can do a raised bed or we can do some remediation. Any other questions? I feel like we've been having a good conversation, and I want to make sure that anybody else who has had thoughts or other questions.
Never feel bad to interrupt our TED Talk. Let's see, I'm making sure nobody posted anything in the chat because we have questions and we have chat. Nope, I don't see anything in the chat. Okay. I don't see anybody with their hand raised. So I think we're good.
All right, well, with the last 4 minutes we have left, I do want to remind you that we have a third webinar coming up. That one will actually be on a Friday. It is going to be on Friday, March 12th. Curtis, what's the theme of that webinar?
That's going to be that's going to be more towards the actual like spring backyard conservation. So more like the theme of our first one, but it'll be pertinent to the actual season we'll be hopefully getting into, and the snow will be gone by then. And then if Kay can correct me, it's also going to be part of the Friends of the Parks schedule of events, if I'm not mistaken. Correct, Kay?
Yep, yep.
So that'll be part of that series as well, and join in with that group of people.
So we will have the registration link for that will be up soon, and it'll be posted on our Facebook page, and I believe on our homepage as well. I've been working on making sort of a mailing list for updates specific to events like this for anybody who would like updates and information on that. We do have a quarterly newsletter that we can subscribe to. And since we only have our number 2 quarterly newsletter coming up, and this is only our second webinar we've ever done. We're still working on getting the publicity for both of those out there, and still sort of coordinating how one helps the other. So I know since the quarterly probably doesn't come out quite enough to keep updated on these events, as we're working on getting more of them scheduled. We're working on getting perhaps another email list just for, hey, we have a webinar coming up. Hey, this is another public event. And especially as we're at the end of the beginning of dealing with the COVID crisis, once COVID is more under control, when we go back to doing public events again, then we'll probably have those emails coming out a little bit more regularly. So we'll see how the future goes for that. So yeah, check out our Facebook page, check out our quarterly newsletter, check out our website for our next registration for the third and final webinar of our urban agriculture series.
The only thing I'd add to that too is as these things come out, the announcements of when these things are going to occur, feel free to share them with anyone you think might be interested. They're free and hopefully informative, and we just like to get the word out there.
Oh, and I almost forgot to mention this plug. Nature's Gate, it's a sort of a natural foods organization, is doing a grant competition for anyone who's just trying to start a community garden. So if you're looking for money to get your garden going, if that's your last hurdle that you need, but you already have a plan, or you're going to have a plan, it opened last week, and I think it closes early in March. So it's a pretty quick turnaround on this grant. It's only open for a few weeks, and then they're going to start the competition and then it's also, I guess it's a voting thing of like who gets to get the grant. So you'll want to go on their website. It shouldn't be too hard to find. I did put a link to it on our events page on our Facebook page. But if you can't find it, you can feel free to send me an email. My email is on the contact information there, and I'll send it along to you. So we are at 1 o'clock. Thank you guys all for attending today. This has been some really good conversation we've had, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.
Goodbye, all.
Goodbye.
Bye.